I've slightly changed the title to South African rugby in the World Cup era as a sports bellwether, and I suppose I had to explain my accent relative to my loyalties and interests. I have 26 years of rugby experience in South Africa, starting with one of the most unlikely playing experiences in global rugby, then as a fan, then as both a scholar and a journalist, including covering a number of Springbok matches and publishing on rugby in South African media, as well as scholarly venues, including a book on the bizarre but I think instructive 1981 Springbok tour to the US. Until 1987, obviously, and the inaugural World Cup, the International Rugby Board punted on the issue of South Africa's role in world rugby, leaving decisions up to individual unions whether to engage with the Springboks and other South African sides. Because of the all-pervasive system of apartheid, in which apartheid sport was emphasized, and rugby was seen to embody Afrikaner nationalism and thus to legitimize the apartheid project, South Africa was rightfully excluded from the new World Rugby Showcase. And while South Africa's presence surely would have changed the competitions, up till 1987, South Africa was arguably the most successful side on earth, with only New Zealand, over whom the Springboks had a winning record, even close, and with the two sides almost always the top sides in the then even smaller rugby world. But the anti-apartheid movement's invocation of Sakos's telling phrase, "no normal sport in an abnormal society," correctly captured the moral issue at hand. For critics, rugby was obviously secondary to South Africa's appalling racial system, which by 1987 had only gotten worse and more appalling under the National Party's ruthless security state. By this point, even those countries most inclined to collaborate with the noxious regime had withdrawn from engagement with SA Rugby. But this is an ignoble list, if you ask me. The British and Irish Lions in 1980, Ireland, New Zealand, and the US in 1981, a near New Zealand return in 1985, replaced by a largely all-black Cavaliers side in 1986, England in 1984, a South American side in 1984 as well, and a cobbled-together World 15 in 1989 being the last unrepentant holdouts between 1980 and South Africa's perhaps hasty 1992 return. In fact, in South Africa, it's common for anti-apartheid folks even today to wear All Blacks jerseys when South Africa plays the All Blacks or anytime the South Africans are playing. In fact, they should be wearing Australia jerseys because Australia, as early as 1970, said, "Oh, hell no." And in fact, the reason that the Springboks ended up going to the US of all places in 1981 was because Australia said, not only are you not flying through here, you're not flying over our airspace, which means you got to fly through the US and Los Angeles into Auckland. By 1995, South Africa was fully back, and without even bidding, South Africa, using the moral force of Nelson Mandela, was able to draw the third IRB World Cup to South Africa. We all know the result of that and the much ballyhooed meaning it was freighted with. It has, of course, been overstated in terms of its impact on South Africa. It did not, as John Carlin asserted in the subtitle of his book, make a nation. That's not how history works. It's certainly not how post-apartheid South African history has worked. It's not even how sporting history in South Africa has worked, given that association football, soccer, is far more important in the country than rugby, even if Siya Kolisi's men have helped close that gap. Nonetheless, 1995 proved that South Africa and its bullying in-your-face style was back. Chester Williams was instrumentalized in this process, the third black Springbok and the second in his family, being used to represent a rainbow nation that the team did not really represent. The end of the 1995 World Cup fed almost directly into the long overdue, and some might say merely formalized, emergence of professionalism. But this formalization marked a profound change, one that had been in the heart of conflict since at least the mid-1890s, and at the time effectively led to the creation of the Rugby League. The myth of rugby amateurism had become anachronistic by the 1990s, by which point France had long thumbed its nose, as had Italy, Eastern Europe, and players such as Nas Botha. Meanwhile, myths that stem from Nelson Mandela donning the number 6 Francois Pienaar jersey notwithstanding, race issues and outright racism continued to plague South African rugby. The old guard gave way slowly and reluctantly, with individual acts of racism and barbarism seemingly buttressed by institutional factors. Gio Cronje and the Quinton Davids affair, where Cronje refused to room with Quinton Davids, essentially implying that he was dirty. Louis Light, who was a fertilizer salesman, and never in history has someone's profession lined up so perfectly with his personality, because no one's ever been so full of shit. And even to the present, race hovers over South African rugby, even in its good moments. In the midst of all of this, of course, the Northern Hemisphere moment that increasingly looks like a blip came in 2003, though 2023 looks like the best chance to break that streak. Meanwhile, in 2007, South Africa is getting closer to representativeness, but not there yet. There's Brian Habana, obviously World Player of the Year, Ricky January, Okonu Ngane, JP Peterson, Ashwin Willemse. But suddenly South Africa was not alone, as these questions were beginning to be more serious across global rugby, especially perhaps in Australia and in particular New Zealand, where sometimes these questions could be swept under the rug because, one, New Zealand had been so successful, except for perhaps in World Cups, and two, hey, it's not like we're South Africa. 2011 to 2015 sees the reemergence of New Zealand in the World Cup era. It runs the risk of the sport becoming somewhat played in the increasing shadow of the all-black jersey. In a small sport, it's not necessarily good for a team to be dominant. 2015, of course, saw all 4 semifinalists coming from the Southern Hemisphere, which leads to an unacknowledged crisis, especially if you take into account Lions tours increasingly seeming to validate the Southern Hemisphere dominance. I know you disagree with me, but Lions have won 1 tour in the 21st century, drew another, and have lost 4. To an all-star team of the home nations. I don't care how little they get to practice together. Imagine if Australia, New Zealand, and South Africa put together an all-star team, no one would touch them. But what New Zealand certainly did show is how open play can work in the elite game at the top levels. Not that this is a lesson for France, for example, not one they've ever needed, but it felt like a shakeup compared to, say, South Africa's wins, which in '95 and 2007 saw them win without scoring a try in the final. Compelling in its way for traditionalists, but hardly scintillating. Indeed, we saw this effect in 2019. Yes, perhaps most notably, this was the first time this was a true Rainbow Nation South African team, led by Siya Kolisi, but also other black players, including from African roots, particularly Xhosa. But one that began to break other stereotypes as well. Yes, South Africa is physical. But while people weren't paying attention, they've developed as talented a free-playing 9 through 15 as there is in World Rugby, with depth to spare. Makazole Mapimpi and Cheslin Colby showed as much in those 2019 finals, reaffirmed it in the 2021 Lions series, and there are only 2 of a stack of talented multi-positional backline guys who allow for the team to do a 6-2 or even a 7-1 split, but also to have a different backline every match if they so choose. Meanwhile, the COVID-19 pandemic proved a challenge to rugby as much as it did to any sport on earth. And arguably, the game that emerged from COVID was transformed far more than any sport on earth. For example, American sports picked up right where they left off in our professional leagues. Global soccer's elite leagues were little impacted, yet the shakeup in rugby was tectonic, especially with regard to the interaction of professional teams in the Southern Hemisphere, and in the case of South Africa, their connections with the North. In the case of New Zealand and Australia, with their relationship to Pacific rugby, and in Japan, with a commitment to strengthening their professional league and looking inward. The early empty Capetown Stadium for the Lions tour was one side of this coin, but South Africa's performance in the first 2 seasons of their major Super Rugby clubs transitioning to the URC is the other side. Changes in world rugby and South Africa's role as a fulcrum or as a canary in a coal mine, I think, is important in understanding this process. On the one hand, there's South Africa's relative continued success as a national side. On the other is the state of the domestic game in, say, the Currie Cup. The tenuous state of the relationship with the Sanzar nations, as evidenced by the end, perhaps necessary, of South Africa's place in Super Rugby, and of South Africa being dependent on a potentially subservient relationship with the URC powers that be. A concern is that South Africa will come to resemble the rest of the continent's relationship with the former European metropoles, extracting resources in the form of players without developing the game in South Africa. There will never be a player shortage coming from south of the Orange and Limpopo rivers, but where those players play, what their relationship will be to South African clubs, and when the music stops playing in the global game of rugby musical chairs, will South Africa find themselves without a seat? Which leads to a series of questions. And the nice thing about ending something with a series of questions is that I don't have to come up with a series of answers. Will there be a global calendar? And whose calendar will take center stage? Obviously, the South African winter is quite different from the Northern Hemispheric winter. What to do with the growing minnows? Will there be an integrated European league with promotion and relegation to and from 6 nations? What of the role of Pacific Island nations as a seeming farm system for Tier 1 nations, New Zealand surely, but hardly just New Zealand? What will the professional leagues look like, especially in the Southern Hemisphere? Will the U.S. continue to be a sleeping giant that naps too frequently? What of rugby in Africa, Asia, South America? In other words, will the sport develop true depth? Think about the rugby of the upset in 2015 with Japan. The number 11 team in any setup beating the number 3 team should not be a monumental upset. For example, if today Germany defeated Brazil in world football, would anyone be stunned? Germany's ranked 15th in the world right now. Brazil's ranked 3rd. We wouldn't even think twice about that if a team in the 30s beat someone in the single digits. There isn't that much depth in world rugby, and we need to develop it. Will World Rugby figure out that you can't seed a World Cup 3 years in advance and have it hold any integrity at all? Is Southern Hemisphere playing dominance compatible with Northern Hemisphere economic and political dominance? Will we get a handle on the rules regarding head injuries, but also consistency of refereeing in an age when technology allows all of us to see endless replays from multiple angles in real time? In other words, what will the game look like going forward? And can the manifest strengths and weaknesses of South Africa shine a light on what can be done and what needs to be done? Thank you.
Thank you, Derek. I'm sure plenty of questions.
So I'm interested in your perspective on players representing nations that they're born out of as well, because I think I probably won't quote the stat properly, but of the top 10 nations, I think South Africa and Argentina were 2 of the only ones that had a squad of only born and raised in South Africa. Yet the strength or the weakness of the club game that is being exposed, do you see that changing, and do you see any cultural reason why South Africa have that as a almost a unique point?
Well, they almost didn't, though. Remember, a lot of countries weren't allowing players who didn't play within domestic structures to then play on the national team, which created decisions that guys had to make, particularly veteran guys who were seeing the end of their career. The reality is that rugby hasn't gotten a handle on any of these kinds of topics since professionalism, because the connection with exchange rates and where you play your professional career and what authority they have relative to your national team standing, that has not been reconciled. And then the issue of sort of parentage and birth and all that, particularly in an increasingly transnational global world, is just a kettle of fish that we haven't reconciled ourselves to. Furthermore, much of it is legitimate, right? I mean, what if you are of binational parentage and you get an opportunity to play for Scotland, right? Why would you not? And obviously I'm thinking Duhan van der Merwe. But it becomes a difficult question because you can't separate it from the exploitation. You can't separate it from both being cast aside by New Zealand if you're not quite good enough, but you're good enough to play for a whole bunch of other countries, some of which you might have some connection to. And then on the other hand, the poaching of countries like New Zealand. And before we claim too much virtue for South Africa, let's remember that Beast, Tendai Mtawarira was from Zimbabwe. And the South Africans have occasionally poached viable players from Namibia as well. So this South African, look, the depth of talent in South Africa is the one thing that keeps them in the conversation. Can't really be denied, and it's always been tenuous, that epicenter of world rugby being in the place where in the World Cup era just isn't as good. It's a really uncomfortable question that the power is based in London, but the quality is based in Johannesburg. And Auckland and elsewhere. And I'll tell you, when South Africa was running through that stretch of mediocrity in 2016 through about 2018, I think it was really potentially worrisome that they could be excluded from Tri-Nations, and then what do you have? Because all that talent in the world, they'll just go to Europe and play, and so I think that's it's going to continue to be the delicate question that we deal with.
I've got a question about, let's say, the regional influence or regional sort of strategy, because we attended the game yesterday, Namibia, another World Cup without any victory. On the long term, it's not good for South Africa and South Africa region in general. So is there any strategy or plan, or is South Africa only looking at New Zealand, Europe, and
Oh yeah, South Africa doesn't identify with African rugby at all, and never really have. and certainly won't anytime particularly soon. I mean, the only question is whether or not, you have a Namibian Currie Cup team, and that has happened. There's been talk about a Zimbabwean one, but then they, even in the B level, they get crushed. And then, there's only so much South Africa can do. I mean, do you really want South Africa taking on Namibia as a courtesy game every 3 or 4 years? The answer to that is you do not. And so even Namibia isn't going to be in a position where they're going to consistently play South Africa's under 20s, who would also mash them. And then you can't be playing under 19s, who they would probably beat. But what kind of victory is that? It's like beating up your younger brother. It's fun, but you can only do it so often. And so that, I mean, what's got to happen in African rugby is those nations that play need to work together to consolidate. I mean, I'm doing a project on African rugby outside of South Africa, and do you know how many of these national sides don't even have a website? It's shocking how little information there is out there. You want to find out about Ghana, Ghana's national rugby team? Wikipedia, and it doesn't have much. And so they're so far outside, and they're not alone. I mean, look at Argentina's relationship in a lot of ways to America's rugby, right? They have an Argentina 15 that's connected to the larger structure, but Argentina never plays in the America's Rugby Championship. They'd win every time, and it would be fun to humiliate the Americans, I'm sure, but it wouldn't serve them any purpose. And that's the other problem with it being so small. I mean, look at Europe, right? Do you think England's ever going to take an even remote chance of getting relegated? That's why you're not going to have promotion and relegation, because England's not going to, France isn't going to, Ireland isn't going to, and even Scotland sees themselves as too good for it. And why would Italy sign on to their own annual relegation and promotion? They'd ping pong back and forth regularly, right? I mean, how many wooden spoons has Italy gotten? Almost all of them. Occasionally Scotland, but I mean, Italy would find themselves playing Romania, Georgia, Spain every year. And so it's not in their interest. So until World Rugby develops policies beyond what's in the interest of the 9 or 10 biggest rugby playing countries, you're going to have these dilemmas, because no one's going to want to open up the club too much. It's a cute little story that Georgia has a nice scrum that you play against and you're worried about, and then you beat them by 35. And that's the best team of those clubs, Everybody's ready for coffee.
I know we're talking about South Africa, but what do you think the path for the US looks like going into 31 and 33? Because partly because of your accent and where you're from, but also I think because are the lessons to be learned? I think John had dropped something in the comments in one of the sessions yesterday about the investment, the World Rugby investment for 31 and 33 in the men's and women's games in the US. The US Rugby Association falling into administration, the rebuilding around that. Are there any things that they can learn from the journey of some of the other nations?
The question isn't can we? The question would be will we? And I would suspect the answer to that is no, because again, I doubt that the United States rugby officials, who I've actually had some interaction with, I've covered some U.S. rugby and the rugby sevens in the U.S. They're going to be looking to the elite nations because the United States sees itself as that kind of country, when they really should be looking at what Spain and Chile and others are doing. Certainly Chile and Portugal, who beat them, right? The biggest problem is just in the American sporting hierarchy, rugby doesn't rank that high. And even though our collegiate rugby has gotten to be okay, it's literally a bunch of guys who discovered the sport in college. And I don't care how good an athlete you are. For one thing, you're not playing football in a college at the college level, our football. Then the thing becomes, okay, well, you take the 500 guys who get cut from NFL rosters every summer, and you'd have a lot of really good athletes. And you'd have speed, you'd have size, you'd have a lot. But as everybody here knows, you can be the best athlete imaginable, and you go out against someone who actually knows what they're doing, you're going to get you're going to get crushed, right? I mean, you get a bunch of great, you get a bunch of great rugby players, and they go out and play volleyball against guys who actually know what they're doing playing volleyball. They're going to get massacred, no matter how relatively high in the hierarchy they are. And so that's the age-old problem with American rugby, is there are only like 2 states that even have high school rugby, and all those kids are kids who aren't playing football. So it becomes a dilemma now. Will we invest the resources by hosting the World Cup? Possibly. I can see an American rugby team that suddenly has a bunch of guys named Van der Merwe and Tagovailoa and things like that, rather than, Smith and CATSAM and all that. So I don't know. I mean, I don't have much. One of the things I talk about in my book is that, the American rugby team got crushed in that 1981 tour. And even as we've entered into professionalism, they've gotten crushed even worse, right? The last time they played, it was something like 65-8. And that test in Glenville, New York was 35-6, but they were playing on a slanted polo field, and so in the first half it was only like 6-4, and it was some ridiculousness, and then suddenly the game tilted that way, and the game really tilted that way, and so I have a hard time mustering up interest in American rugby.
Just on that, if I'm not mistaken, I think Toulouse is currently in the US. Yeah. So I think also maybe Clermont had I don't know if it's a fling or a partnership or something like that. So
it's not a marriage.
No. So that's interesting, because based on what you're saying, thinking that Toulouse, that is obviously sportingly speaking, but businessly speaking as well, a huge mammoth. What are they doing over there?
Well, the same reason South Africa went in 1981. We still have dollars, and rugby. And look, rugby's not that rich a sport. You can break into rugby in ways. I mean, what I was talking about with a couple of you yesterday, right? It's changed, I think, a little bit in the last couple of years, but 3 years ago there were only 10 rugby players on the planet earning £1 million a year. They don't make this isn't soccer kind of money. And even then, every year Manchester United or Arsenal or Chelsea come to the US and beat up on the MLS All-Star team and then go home is kind of a warm-up thing. Like we got the money. We have the facilities, right? The big issue will be that it'll never be a stadium sport in the US except for during the World Cup. So yeah, I mean, it'll be awfully fun when they play in Cowboys Stadium or when they play in Gillette Stadium or when they play in New York. It'll be fun. It'll be fun to watch South Africa and New Zealand play that game. Watching America lumber around the field against Georgia might be a little less interesting, but it'll draw the fans, and then who knows? Because it's a great game. And you'd like to think that would help. You'd also like to think that it would have the impact that the FIFA World Cup had in 1994, where the U.S. still is what it is, but is better than what it was, right? The U.S. can kind of, occasionally make a World Cup and occasionally draw against England, and then and that kind of thing. But we're never going to win. But MLS has become a respectable, 20th best league, and that's the other thing is with dollars and with the relative paucity of money in rugby compared to other sports, Major League Rugby can have a presence in a way quicker than MLS. I mean, Major League Rugby is probably already a top 10 league, certainly a top 15 league. I mean, it's worse than the second division everywhere in Europe, but it's better than any other league in a non-Six Nations /Sanzar world. And there's no reason why it won't be better than, if it isn't already, Argentina's league, right? Because we're getting, we got Beast and Power era came, and then COVID ruined that for us. But you're going to get those kinds of players towards the end of their career and at the beginning of their career. And that's the kind of thing that adds legitimacy to a second-rate league. Is, yeah, you can laugh that it's a retirement league, but you laugh all the way to the bank, right? And I can tell you leagues that aren't retirement leagues, Curry Cup isn't really a retirement league. And so, hey, if that's what you are, that's what you are. Worse things. All right.
I think we're on time. Thank you, Derek.
Thank you.